Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. The Browns have had a disappointing season, no doubt about that, but that doesn't mean that every single player on the team has been a disappointment. There's actually been a few bright spots from some young players that you are hoping to show you some promise that have happened this year that have flown under the radar because the Browns just quite frankly aren't that successful. And when you aren't successful, things like young players playing well tends to not get the attention that it usually would get if the team was obviously winning, right? Because you have to focus on so many of the problems with the Cleveland Browns. You never really get time to talk about some of the things that are going well for the team, even if they are on a much smaller scale than what is wrong with the team. So that's what I'm here to talk about. Let's talk about some bright spots for the Cleveland Browns. Now, a lot of these guys are going to be on defense. I've noticed that a lot of the bright spots on this team are on defense, and it's important to remember while the defense is a disappointment compared to last year's performance, which was all world, there's still not a bad defense out there. And I think the game they had against Kansas City, where they pretty much fought Kansas City tooth and nail, was the only reason that game had a chance to even be close at the end, because of the strong effort they put in. Kind of tells you that their defense still has something there that can be salvaged. So I know some people were asking me about firing Jim Schwartz. I think that's the last thing that they should do there. I think Jim Schwartz has been really good for this defense. But let's talk about some bright spots on this defense, particularly with the young players. Mike Hall. Every time Mike Hall gets an opportunity to play, I am concerned that he hasn't had enough time to prepare and that he's not going to play well because of that, right? That happened at the beginning of the season where he missed games because of suspension, missed a good chunk of camp because of injuries and suspension. And I was worried, hey, when he comes in the middle of the season, it's not going to look the way that you want it to look. But then he plays well, then he gets injured, put on IR. And I'm like, damn, that's another blow, right? So one, he comes back from IR, which was a pleasant surprise to see from Mike Hall. And then two, when he does come back from IR, he looks good. He looked pretty good against Kansas City, right? He was a nice piece to add in there. He was pass rushing well. Where I am surprised with Mike Hall, pleasantly so, is that he is not a horrid run defender so far in his career, because that's what was the projection to be, right? He'd be a pretty good pass rusher, but a pretty bad run defender. I thought his comp would be somewhere similar to like Larry Ogunjobi, who was a great pass rusher, horrible run defender. But that's not been the case with Mike Hall Jr. He's actually been as good of a run defender as he's been a pass rusher, and I feel really good about that, because if you look at this guy's natural skill set, he's going to be a good pass rusher. He has that quick burst off the line of scrimmage, that swim move that if he perfects is unstoppable. Great athletic ability, left to right movement, like all of that stuff projects him to be a really good pass rusher. But if he has a good feel for the run game at the NFL level, and he's only going to get stronger and more experienced and better at football, because remember, Mike Hall, I believe he just turned 21 recently. Like, he is super young. Let me double check that on his age here. But I believe Mike Hall is like a super, super young player, which, again, good thing for the Cleveland Browns. Mike Hall is 21 and a half years old, so he's super young. And when you see a young player playing that well in run D, and then also with that pass rush skill set that he has, that we saw at the Senior Bowl, we saw at the training camp, we saw in the preseason, and we saw when he played in games at the beginning of the season, Mike Hall looks like he could be a massive hit at the second round position, and be somebody who helps anchor that defensive line long term with Myles Garrett. And like, I just get excited about thinking about the idea of the Browns sitting there in the top 5, being able to add an Abdul Carter or a Mason Graham to this defensive line with everything else that they have here, because there's another name that I want to mention that's been very exciting on the defensive line as well, Isaiah McGuire. Now, this has a lot more to it than Mike Hall, but Mike Hall has so many skills that you don't really need a ton of overwhelming evidence to be like, oh no, he might be really good. Isaiah McGuire, who was, I think, a third or fourth round pick for the Cleveland Browns, was seen as somebody who was a bit of a steal to get in the fourth round, right? He was really highly regarded coming out of Missouri. Didn't play much last year, but he's played a lot this year. And consistently, Isaiah McGuire has been graded as a excellent run defender. Before they traded for Zadarius Smith, that was the case. I talked about it extensively on this channel, that's probably why the Browns felt comfortable moving on from, Zadarius Smith. But now that Zadarius Smith is gone, now that Isaiah McGuire is getting all of those snaps there, he still looks really, really good as a run defender. And again, you look at this Browns defensive line, and you start thinking about what they can add to it in the draft, right? Like if you just decide to go best player available, you're probably talking about adding a defensive lineman, right? Because those are going to be the players that could be available, that could fall to you whatever spot that you're sitting at in the draft. And you look at this defensive line, you have Myles Garrett, who is legitimately a first ballot Hall of Famer already before the age of 30. And he's only, 27, 28 years old. Mike Hall, who again looks like he could be a star potentially at the 3-tech position if things continue to go well and if he is able to stay out of trouble off the field, which I think is going to be the case, right? He seems like a well-adjusted enough young man. I feel old saying that. I know he had the issue with his situation at the beginning of the season, but I feel like that was more of a result of him getting himself into a bad situation, maybe by immaturity playing a role into that, than him just being somebody who puts themselves in bad situations like on a consistent basis. So hopefully that bears out and he's able to see his potential on the field and he doesn't have these off the field issues. But if he's able to live up to his potential is immense. He could be a star player in the NFL. And then when you add that next to Myles Garrett, you got Isaiah McGuire, who looks like he's going to be a really solid rundown defender, one of the better rundown defenders in the NFL at this point, who's been really helpful for a team that's been struggling to stop the run. He's been part of why the Browns, since trading Zadarius Smith, have been a little bit better at stopping the run defensively, right? Because they're giving him more snaps. There's another player that I'm going to talk about that they've been giving more snaps that I've been excited to see. But yeah, Isaiah McGuire been out there, been a really good run defender. He still needs to improve as a pass rusher. He's not a great pass rusher, but he's still a young player, right? This is somebody in their second year in the NFL playing on the line of scrimmage, where we expect a 2-3 year developmental curve for these kind of players. But the fact that he's able to provide this level of run defense, like you look at him, he's one of the highest graded run defenders in the NFL currently. You can't help but get excited about that. And then look at this defensive line. I talked about Myles Garrett, talked about Mike Hall, talked about Isaiah McGuire, but you're also going to add, Alex Wright, who we felt really good about before his injury, right? He had that game-winning safety that the Browns got a victory off of in Jacksonville. So this defensive line, like you look at the young players here, it's a total carbon flip from what they were in like 2021, where I looked at this young defensive line. I'm like, hey man, outside of Myles Garrett, you got nothing promising there, right? Like we were looking at like Jordan Elliott and Tommy Togiai and all this garbage they had on the defensive line. But now I look at it, I feel so much better about it outside of Myles, because I think Isaiah McGuire is going to be a solid run defender. Mike Hall, who I thought his problem would be run defending, his issue is not run defending. And I know he's going to develop into a strong pass rusher. I think that was always going to be in the cards for him. You got Alex Wright, who you feel really good about. Unfortunately, he didn't get to play a ton this season, but when he's out there, he's somebody who could flip between 3 and 4 on your defensive line. And then you have somebody like Juwan Briggs, who is I think a 7th round pick. He is the only other defensive tackle we have on this team that is 300 plus pounds other than Dalvin Tomlinson, which is something that I've been begging for this team to add, right? They've only had one 300 plus pounder that they are comfortable keep active. Siaki Ika was the other one, but he was not good enough to be active. You get Jawan Briggs, and look, he's only played 3 games with the Cleveland Browns. The last 2 games, he's been pretty solid as a run defender, and that's better than whatever you got out of Siaki Ika his whole run here. So I'm excited about what Jawan Briggs brings to the table, right? It's not going to be sexy stuff. He's a big man. He's just going to be asked to occupy space, but don't underestimate the value of having somebody in that defensive line who's really good at taking up space. That's how you get everything else flowing. Like if you look what Pittsburgh does, they tend to have somebody who could take up space. It's not normally like a zero tech. I don't think they've had a zero tech since like Tyson Alualu, but they have guys in there whose specialty isn't necessarily to get to the quarterback, is to fill gaps, right? Like to just take up space so your linebackers can get through, so your edge rushers can get through, so you can be creative and just occupy space there. The Browns haven't had a ton of guys like that, and I think Jawan Briggs has done a really, really good job of being able to do that. I look at this defensive line, I look at the future of it, I look at the fact that they could add a blue chip prospect to that defensive line, like just the prospect of adding Abdul Carter. Woo. It's exciting. It's exciting when you look at that defensive line, right? Or even a Mason Graham, because this defensive line already has a lot of really good young players that I think are going to continue to take steps in their development going forward. And if you can add another young name to that who is projected to be a star, then you're talking about a defensive line that you could build a team around, right? That you could build a philosophy around defensively. And we know how good Jim Schwartz's defenses are when he has a dominant defensive line. The reason the Browns were all world last year is because that defensive line was dominant. This year, there's been moments of dominance for this defensive line. They've had a lot of injuries throughout the year. Some of the players they relied on didn't play as well as they did the year prior, right? Like Maurice Hurst. But when they've been able to get that consistently solid play out this defensive line, like we saw last week, where you got Mike Hall out there, Isaiah McGuire, Jawan Briggs, all giving you quality snaps at their respective defensive line positions, then all of a sudden this defense looks a lot better. If you could add another name to that, like another big-time prospect to that, you could be cooking with gas next year when it comes to the defense. And we know how much this defense being at that high level that they were last year can just flip the narrative on a football team instantly, right? So that is something that I'm really excited about, this defensive line, the young prospects on it. Another area I'm excited about is linebacker, right? Because unfortunately with JOK's injury, we've gotten to see a lot of Devin Bush, a lot of Mohamed Diabate, and a lot of Jordan Hicks. Guys that, I think outside of Jordan Hicks, we weren't expecting to see a ton of, especially play at the linebacker position. But to my surprise, especially when it comes to Devin Bush, those guys have played actually quite well this season for the Cleveland Browns. And look, I'm going to give some credit to Coach Tarver because I don't feel like he gets enough credit for the work that he does, but feels to me that that's the best position coach the Browns have had in the Stefanski Barry era, because not only has he been able to develop players at that linebacker position consistently, right, going all the way back to 2020 where he was able to get good stuff out of A-Walk and anybody else who walked at Sione Takitaki, right? He's done a great job of developing these guys without getting the resources that other coaches get to develop these guys. He's done a great job with JOK. JOK's become one of the best players on this defense when he's healthy. I even look at somebody like Grant Delpit as somebody who Tarver probably had a little bit in the hand of helping because he plays so much in the box that you would imagine some of that is being coached by the linebackers coach. He's done a good job. Like the Browns linebackers coach has done a good job. He's developed these linebackers. You look at the Browns right now, they're getting good play out of Devin Bush. They're getting good play out of Mohamed Diabate. Devin Bush was a flyer. Diabate is a undrafted free agent. And then even Jordan Hicks is somebody who, was about at the end of their career, 29, 30 years old for a linebacker. We're getting some really, really good play out of him. our linebackers coach knows what he's doing. Like, that guy's good. And he's developing some good young players at that linebacker position, and you're able to do it without the resources that, other positions have required to be able to get better on this team. Ronnie Hickman Jr. has obviously been a bright spot for this team too. He is not playing better than Juan Thornhill, but I think Juan Thornhill, especially like this week against Kansas City, played a lot better than I think people will give him credit for. But what Ronnie Hickman has done well for this team is be able to run defend from that free safety position. I think there's something there with Ronnie Hickman. Now, is he going to be a starter at free safety? No, I don't think he's your future starter at free safety, even though you can get away with starting him at free safety for sure. I would like a little bit more of a playmaker, but if you're so dominant on the defensive line next year and your linebackers are doing a really good job, then you can have like a Ronnie Hickman out there. Like, he's a fringe starter, definitely somebody who's excellent to have in reserve. And I think that's a bright spot for this team as well. And then let's talk about the main bright spot of the team, right? And that's on the offensive side of the ball. And that is Sir Jerry Jeudy, who has cracked 1,000 yards for the first time in his NFL career. Now, again, you ask him, he probably would have wanted to do this under better circumstances with the Browns playing a better season than what they've had. But he's coming off of an 11 reception, 108-yard game. He is at 1,052 yards, and he has had like 700 yards in the last 7 weeks. And like, you can't play that game that people like to play with Amari Cooper, where you're like, yeah, he has a bunch of yards, but he got it all in one game. He has consistently gotten over 70 yards this season, especially since Jameis Winston has entered the lineup, which is significant because Jameis Winston is not even good. He's just better than Deshaun Watson. So, like, imagine if you could get decent quarterback play to Jerry Jeudy. How much would that change the math on what he's able to do? Like, I wasn't one of these people who thought he would be a number one wide receiver for you. I thought it'd be a good signing, right? $18 million is really good for, not 18, like $16 million or whatever they signed him to was really good money for a number two wide receiver who could fringe be a number one guy. But these numbers he's putting up are number one wide receiver numbers, right? We're talking about 14 targets against the Kansas City Chiefs. That's a good defense, right? And he's able to come out of that with 108 yards, 9.8 per reception. Like, you're able to use him in so many different ways. And look, we're only in week 15. There are 3 more weeks left in the season for the Cleveland Browns, 3 more games left in the season for them. It is very possible that Jerry Jeudy ends up with the second best Browns receiving season of all time. Like, that's what we're talking about here. And, like, think about what wide receivers who are capable of getting 1,200, 1,300 yards, who are also 26 years old, get on the free market. Andrew Berry likes to get ahead of the market, right? That's his biggest strategy that you can identify. He loves to get ahead of the market. He wants to beat the market. And sometimes that tendency helps the team a ton. Like Myles Garrett's contract. The Browns have never been at the top of the market with Myles Garrett, despite Myles Garrett being the best defensive player in football. That's because Andrew Berry got ahead of it. David Njoku, right? If you would have just let that contract expire, he would have had the year he had last year. That would have been a very expensive contract. He got ahead of the market. He was early on that contract. Same thing with Jerry Jeudy here, right? He got ahead of the market. He got early. He was confident in his bet. He put the money down early. He said, I'm going to give you 3 years on 16 to 18 million based on incentives. And that's going to be the deal. And Jerry Jeudy took that deal. And he's having a year right now that if he had not signed that deal, could put him in line to get like 25, 30 million. Like, that's a brilliant deal by Andrew Berry. Now, obviously, there are times when his attempt to get ahead of the market does not work out for him, right? I think most notably, the Deshaun Watson contract, in part, like some of that's Jimmy Haslam, you would have to imagine. But I imagine that the thought process with that contract was, let's get ahead of the market. They tried to get ahead of the market with Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson failed miserably, and that hurt you. The thing that I don't think enough people talk about is he got successful with getting ahead of the market on enough contracts that even when he failed with the Watson contract to be right on that bet, it kind of gets paid up for because you have so many guys under contract at a number that's lower than what their market value is, that, okay, you can afford to miss on that Watson contract and still have space to maneuver around in free agency next year, despite it feeling like it defies all odds because the Watson contract was so bad. That's the reality of the Browns. Like, they can easily clear up a bunch of cap space next year. And the same thing is true when it comes to like the Dustin Hopkins contract is one that I think people overreact about. Like, it's like $3 million. You can clear that up with like 2 practice squad players. But yeah, it's like, okay, you missed on Dustin Hopkins. And maybe Dustin Hopkins comes back next offseason and kicks really well, so it doesn't matter. But, you know, Dustin Hopkins is what it is right now. Deshaun Watson, that contract's a failure. But you got to head on Miles, so you got Miles for way cheaper than what you should have for like 4 years, and you're going to continue to have him on a cheaper number for the next couple of years because you got ahead of the market there. You got David Njoku for cheaper. Now you have Jerry Jeudy for legitimately $10 million less a year than what the market would have gotten him if he had this season before he hit free agency. So you win some, you lose some with that strategy, but hitting here with Jerry Jeudy, big deal, right? Because you traded Amari Cooper. People were concerned about that. But the second you traded Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman show a lot of promise. Jerry Jeudy hitting over 1,000 yards. I'm so upset that Cedric Tillman got that concussion because I'm really was looking forward to see what he could do. Hopefully he can get back from that concussion sooner than later so we can see more out of him. But yeah, Jerry Jeudy looks like a big bright spot for the Browns season. It's probably the biggest bright spot in this Browns season. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.